In this lecture, I consider appealing to hypocrisy. This is the first of the two nastiest climate negotiation tactics that we have to deal with. And this one's get really personal, and actually where the reason why I initially started to investigate into these tactics and looking at logical fallacies and how they play. Because we see these ones more often than any other tactic. So this is the third of the climate denial, anger, and depression stages of the climate grief cycle. It's also called to quoque, or you also. So it's a very common form of climate negotiation tactic. It's a very common logical fallacy. We see it every day. And as I said, it is one of the most common that we deal with in our climate negotiation work. The objectives of this lesson are to gain familiarity with appealing to hypocrisy as a fallacy and as a climate negotiation tactic, recognize how it can crop up in our climate negotiations, and then finally to develop an understanding of what to do about it. So, what is appealing to hypocrisy? What it means is we're attempting to discredit an argument by exposing the proponent's failure to act consistently in accordance with the argument. Now, I'll expand on that in a bit. That's confusing words, typically the sort of language you would find in a philosophy textbook, and it is a bit dense. So we're going to dig into this in a bit, and you'll see it'll become much more clear as we go on. But it is a type of ad hominem argument, that is, a personal attack. But what it does is it stresses the gaps between our behavior and our argument. And we see it really often in climate negotiation. And it's widely shared on social media. Now, this is where it gets nasty, because usually when we see these appeals to hypocrisy shared around, it's done with a really smug sense of superiority. It's really not nice, because there's a sense of gleeful nastiness about it all. Ha ha, gotcha. So it's important, and we need to confront it. We will have to deal with it personally in our work on climate change, and we can see it applied to or applied to people who we respect who are dealing with climate change out there as well. Well, there's an underlying problem with the tactic, and it's the assumption. And the assumption is that people who lack integrity are, therefore, wrong about everything. And that is, in climate change, poor character invalidates good data. But, the problem is that integrity has no bearing on climate change. It's going to change whether we have good character or not. And the science of climate change is not based on integrity in that way. It's based on data, observation, thermodynamics, and peer review. And, my personal integrity doesn't change any of that. The other thing I would argue is that perfection is not a good metric in terms of legitimacy of an argument. No one's perfect, and we all want to do better. And we can all envisage a better future. And, progress is based on having that vision and moving forward. So I would argue to be suspicious of arguments that demand perfection of the opponent, because I see that as also hypocritical, because it holds the counterparty to a higher standard than we would impose on ourselves. I think George Carlin said this the best. When Thomas Edison worked into the night on the electric light, he had to do it by gas lamp or candle. I'm sure it made the work seem that much more urgent. And that's how I feel about those of us who are out there dealing with climate negotiations. The issue is urgent. But we all live in the modern world, and we have to avail ourselves of those things of the modern world that we live in. We can't just stop, just like none of the rest of us can stop. And that's the issue. The issue is we all live in a culture, in a world that relies heavily on fossil energy, fossil products. And we can't just turn that off to have a discussion about it. We have to have a vision of what the future might look like and move towards it. Now, I go to Greta Thunberg as an example here because she dominated the media, social media for sure, and a large part the mainstream media in the second half of 2019 and into the early part of 2020 before the COVID-19 crisis started. And she said, the IPCC says that climate is changing. This change is a real threat, especially for youth who have to deal with it. So listen to the science and take real action. In response, she's told, you wear carbon-based fabrics, you eat food that has a carbon footprint, and you ride on a train that uses fossil energy. You're a hypocrite. Now let's think about this for a bit. So this argument attempts to discredit Greta's argument by discrediting her personally. And it shifts the discussion. So instead of talking about climate change, we're now talking about Greta. And it diverts attention from the real issue. I mean, we're talking about Greta as a person. You know, she's a 16-year-old girl, and the world media was fascinated with who she is, and world leaders were yelling that she's a hypocrite and attacking her parents and all of that. And it's none of it has anything to do with climate change. But what it did argue was that she can't advocate for climate action unless she passes a purity test. But here's the problem with that particular test. The passing grade for the purity test is established by the person who she's arguing with, the critic. And as she passes those tests, I will take a sailboat. I will take the train. What they do is they change the argument. They move the goalpost. We talked about that way back in lesson 1. So this becomes a no-win situation. There is no winning here. But the other thing we should note is just how nasty it all is. But ultimately, the bottom line is we say we can ignore her because she's not pure enough. But the fallacy falls apart very quickly because the demand for perfection is flawed. It argues that it's hypocritical to live in this modern world, and I talked about that for a few moments just early on here. So we have to accept a purity test with unwritten rules judged by those who are rejecting our message and the target's moving. And if you actually fall prey to the argument, then our conversation's over because they don't have to listen to you. So the whole point of the argument is I don't have to listen to you at all. Now, I do in this want to offer a cautionary note. Sometimes accusations of hypocrisy are actually relevant because the discussion we're having, the debate we're having, really is about integrity. So instead of being a side issue to a core argument, it is the argument. And where would we see this? Well, typically when we're talking about the suitability of a political candidate, where people are making major decisions on our behalf, their integrity is important. How about the honesty of a potential new hire? Somebody I'm bringing into my company, somebody I'm going to have to live and work with for a long time. And if it turns out that they're a thief, I might care about that. But in these situations, the integrity is actually the core of the discussion. It's not a side issue. But that's not the case in climate negotiation. And when we start to defend our integrity, or those of the people we work with, it changes the topic. We're no longer talking about climate change. We're talking about the people who advocate for it. This is a symptom of denial. The accuser just doesn't want to talk about climate change, and so they are working to change the topic. And they demand that the messenger defend their character instead. You know, ultimately, as human beings, we find integrity a much more interesting topic and one that's easier to understand than climate change. Climate change is difficult. It involves a whole bunch of numbers, a whole bunch of science that is dense and difficult to understand. So that's not a comfortable discussion. So instead of discussing, is climate change real? We ask the question, is Greta credible? And we, as always, have to beware of the trolls in this, because appealing to hypocrisy is one of the common tactics of trolls. And they really do it on purpose to derail the conversation for themselves, to get some notoriety, and often, as I've said many times before about the trolls, just because they can. Just being bloody-minded nuisance. And social media attracts a lot of these folks. But understand, a troll never listens. Their reward is the bickering. It's the fight. And when we fight back, they win. So, as I said before, never argue with a troll. But we can focus on normal people. Trolls aren't the only people at the table. And if we focus our discussion on the average person who's just trying to understand climate change, they're looking for guidance and understanding. And, we understand that they may repeat the appeal to hypocrisy because it seems reasonable. As I said earlier, it's easy to understand. So they repeat these horrible messages about Greta. They repeat these horrible messages about other scientists just because it's easy to understand and it seems convenient. It's a convenient little argument. What we often don't notice when we do that is just how mean it is. So we're actually piling on in a very nasty situation. So there are a bunch of do's and don'ts, but they're pretty common across the board here. I do argue that we still have to listen. And in this case, because it's so personal, we really have to be patient. It's very difficult not to take the bait when somebody attacks your personal credibility. And we do have to restate the argument clearly, know your core message, know your position, and return to it. Keep coming back to that. And ultimately, you still have to find the common ground. Let's put all of this nastiness aside. What is the core reason why these people are objecting to your message? And as I said, because they're still in this denial, anger, depression stage, don't offer up facts and figures. They just won't respond. They'll just get angry. And this is part of being patient, but don't yield to the temptation to fight. Just go back to your original core message and restate it. And finally, and this is very important, it's never relevant in a climate change discussion to get distracted into arguments about your character. It's not on the table. It's not up for discussion. Now, I actually take lessons from Greta, 16-year-olds teaching the 66-year-old here, because she manages this really well. Because what she does is whenever she is accused of being a hypocrite, she just simply goes back to her core message and repeats it. She points to the threat, and then she turns her back on the argument and walks on to the next event. Because, as she said many times before, it's not about her. It's about climate change. So in our table on the fallacies we consider, the common elements are still the same. Open listening, patience, understanding our position, our core message, and sticking to it, finding common ground. I think the most important thing that we need to realize when someone accuses us of being a hypocrite is we need to resist the urge to fight back in anger. That will just derail the entire discussion. So what did we cover in this lesson? We talked about the appeal to hypocrisy as a fallacy and tactic in climate negotiation, how it crops up in our climate negotiations where we see it, and what you might do about it. Feel free to comment below. Share your experiences with dealing with the appeal to hypocrisy. What's worked? What hasn't worked? If you've had any issues with something I've said, let's hear about it. We've all had our own experiences in dealing with this. And I'd like to include that in our discussion and share it with the rest of the participants of the course.